A medieval home's most important room was often kept under lock and key. This is the story of the buttery, and it has nothing to do with butter. By the end, you will understand the hidden economy of drink that powered an entire era. We will uncover why a trusted officer held the only key and how a simple wall hatch enforced a rigid social order. The logic of this forgotten space reveals a world where ale was more valuable than gold. What does a single room tell us about the people who built it? The word itself is a trick, a linguistic fossil hiding its true nature. A medieval buttery had nothing to do with butter. Its name comes from an older world, from the Old French word buttery, which itself traces back to the Latin word butta, meaning a cask or a bottle, so a buttery was quite literally the bottle room. It was the castle or manor house's dedicated storage and service center for drink. This simple definition is the master key. It explains why the buttery was always separate from the pantry, which stored bread and dry goods, and distinct from the kitchen's heat and chaos. The buttery was a realm of liquids, a cool, dark place designed for casks of ale, barrels of wine, and later, jugs of beer. The officer in charge, the butler, derived his title and his entire identity from this room. He was not just a servant, he was the keeper of the cask, the guardian of the household's most vital liquid currency. To understand the power locked within its walls, you must first see it for what it truly was, a fortress for fermentation. This daily reality transforms the buttery from a simple storage closet into the absolute heart of the home. Think about your own morning routine, that first cup of coffee or tea that feels essential. Now multiply that necessity across every single person in a large household, for every meal from sunrise to sunset. For a medieval lord, his family, his knights, and all the servants, ale was that essential drink. It was a weak, low-alcohol brew, more like a liquid bread, often thick with grains and nutrients. Because water from wells or rivers could be dangerously contaminated, brewing ale, which involved boiling the water, made it safe to consume. So a child might start the day with a small beer, a laborer would be given a ration with his midday meal, and the lord would enjoy finer ales or imported wines at his table. This wasn't about getting drunk, it was about basic survival and daily calories. The buttery, cool and dark, was where this life-sustaining river was dammed and controlled. Its locked doors protected what was, in very real terms, the household's liquid food supply. A failed brew or a tapped cask meant more than disappointment, it meant a genuine crisis. So when we picture that heavy door and the butler's key, we are not looking at security for a luxury. We are witnessing the protection of something as fundamental as the bread in the pantry. The buttery's importance was measured in pints and quarts, the very units of daily life. This strategic placement reveals a hidden logic in the medieval floor plan. Walk from the bustling great hall where the household dined toward the smoky chaos of the kitchens. Before you reach the heat, you would pass through a cooler, darker transitional space. This was the buttery. Its location was a masterstroke of domestic engineering. It served as a buffer zone, a calm intermediary between the social theater of the hall and the fiery workshop of the kitchen. Being directly accessible from the hall meant the butler could swiftly respond to calls for more ale during a feast. Yet its separation from the kitchen's constant fires was absolutely critical. Those roaring hearths would have ruined the ale, warming the casks and spoiling the careful fermentation, so the buttery was kept deliberately cool, a cave for casks. Its architecture was brutally functional. Thick stone walls, sometimes partially underground, acted as a natural refrigerator. Windows were small or non-existent, not for a view, but to block sunlight and keep the temperature constant year-round. Inside, you would find not fine furniture, but utilitarian shelving built to hold the immense weight of barrels, and a sturdy wooden counter called the buttery hatch for service. The floor was often stone, sloped slightly toward a central drain. Imagine the inevitable spills from tapping casks and sloshing jugs. This simple drain allowed for easy sluicing with water, keeping the precious stores clean and the room from becoming a swamp. Every single design choice, from its location to its drainage, whispered the same purpose: preserve and protect the liquid lifeblood of the home. but the locked door was only the beginning of the buttery story. The true power resided in the man who held the key. The butler was far more than a simple servant. He was a senior officer of the household, a manager of liquid assets. His title, derived directly from the room he commanded, signified a role built on absolute trust. Those keys at his belt were not just for show, they controlled access to what amounted to the home's liquid treasury. Imagine the responsibility. He was the household's chief procurement officer for all drink, negotiating with brewers and vintners, judging the quality of a new barrel of ale, and knowing the exact level of every cask in his care. His ledger was a vital document, tracking every gallon purchased, every pint served, and every drop accounted for. This was a position of serious financial stewardship. For a noble household's consumption of ale and wine represented a massive, ongoing expense. But his duty extended beyond the ledger. During meals in the Great Hall, the butler was a visible figure of authority. He would personally supervise the drawing of ale from the casks, ensuring it was served at the proper strength and without waste. He directed a team of lower servants, the cup-bearers and pages, who carried the jugs to the tables. In that moment, standing at the buttery hatch, he controlled the flow of hospitality itself. A slow or meager service would reflect poorly on the Lord's generosity. A generous and smooth pour reinforced the Lord's wealth and goodwill, so the butler's domain was both practical and deeply symbolic. The buttery was his office, his warehouse, and the command center from which he upheld one of the most important social rituals of daily life. His authority, literally forged in iron keys, made him a pillar of the entire domestic order. The butler's key unlocked more than just casks of ale. Within that cool, stone-walled room sat an entire economy of household liquids, each with its own vital purpose. Tallow candles and simple lamps fueled by fish or vegetable oil would be stored here, away from the kitchen's intense heat. Light was a precious resource, and the fuel for it was guarded alongside the drink. You would also find barrels of vinegar, a workhorse liquid used for preserving vegetables, tenderizing meat in marinades, and even as a basic cleaning agent. Then there was salt. It seems out of place until you understand its immense value. Salt was not just a seasoning, it was the primary means of preserving meat for the long winter months. A large, locked chest within the buttery often held this granular treasure, protecting it from waste and theft. In a grander household, the buttery's shelves might boast exotic imports, like amphorae of olive oil from the Mediterranean or small casks of sweet, fortified wines from the East. So the buttery was never just a bottle room. It was the secure cabinet for anything valuable that could be poured, measured, or carefully rationed. This multifaceted storage reveals a broader truth. The medieval household ran on a liquid and granular economy, and the butler was its chief accountant. Every item in his care, from the ale for the servants to the oil for the Lord's lamp, represented a calculated investment and a necessity. The room's very existence tells us that security was not just about keeping things in, it was about managing a precise system of distribution. This rigid control of access was made physical by a small, brilliant piece of architecture, the service hatch. Carved directly into the thick wall between the buttery and the great hall, this opening was often called a squint. It was just a simple window or a barred pass-through, but its purpose was profound. While the Lord and his guests feasted in the hall, they would not see the bustle of the buttery. Instead, a servant inside the cool, dark room would draw ale from a cask and place a filled tankard on the hatch's sill. From the other side, a cup-bearer of slightly higher status would collect it and carry it to the tables. This tiny portal created an invisible barrier, a one-way valve for hospitality. It ensured a constant, smooth flow of drink without allowing the lower-ranking kitchen and buttery staff to intrude upon the social theater of the meal. The squint enforced a silent hierarchy. It protected the Lord's space from the practical mess of service, keeping the sawdust from the floor and the splash from the barrels out of sight. More importantly, it guaranteed that every drink served, especially the Lord's own cup, came directly from the butler's controlled stores, passing through a trusted chain of hands. This was not just about efficiency, it was about security and spectacle. The Great Hall was a stage where the Lord displayed his generosity and power. The squint allowed that performance to proceed uninterrupted, while the vital and messy work of sustaining it happened discreetly behind the scenes. The wall, with its deliberate little window, perfectly embodied the medieval world's obsession with order, separating the labor that fueled society from the privilege that enjoyed its fruit. This meticulous accounting reveals a silent war against waste. The butler's ledger was his weapon, a daily chronicle of liquid assets. Every morning, he would check the levels in his casks, noting how much ale remained from the night before. When a new brew was delivered, its total volume was recorded immediately. Then, throughout the day, he would mark each serving dispensed, a tally for the Lord's table, a ration for the stable hands, a measure for the kitchen staff. This was not mere bookkeeping. It was a system of accountability designed to leave no room for mystery. If a cask was emptying faster than the math allowed, the butler knew someone was helping themselves. The fear of pilferage was very real. For a servant earning a few pennies a year, a stolen jug of ale represented a significant bonus, a moment of warmth and comfort taken in secret. But for the household, unchecked theft could drain the reserves and blow a hole in the annual budget. The locked door, the single key, and the service hatch were all physical answers to this human temptation. They created a bottleneck, a single point of control where every drop could be witnessed and recorded. Imagine the butler standing at his counter, watching a servant present an empty jug. He would fill it from a specific cask, note the amount in his book, and only then hand it over. The system treated trust as a rare commodity, something to be verified with ink and iron at every turn. Even the architecture conspired against theft. The buttery was often accessible only through the hall or a narrow passageway, never from the outside walls. There were no back doors for a discreet exit with a pilfered flagon. This room, in its very bones, was built on suspicion as much as necessity, a fortress protecting its liquid gold from the very people who lived within its walls. Yet the buttery never stood alone. To understand its full purpose, you must see it beside its counterpart, the pantry. These two rooms were the twin engines of domestic service, each with a clearly defined and separate domain. While the butler ruled over liquids, the pantry was the kingdom of dry goods, commanded by an officer called the pantler. His responsibility was the solid sustenance, the loaves of bread, sacks of flour, wheels of hard cheese, and sometimes even the household's linen. Picture the workflow. A servant needing bread for the hall would go to the pantry's hatch. A servant needing ale would go to the buttery's squint. This deliberate division was a masterpiece of medieval logistics. It prevented a chaotic bottleneck of staff all clamoring in one room. It also fostered deep, specialized knowledge. The pantler became an expert in grains, knowing how to store flour to keep it from weevils and how to judge the quality of a loaf. The butler, as we have seen, mastered the science of fermentation and the economics of drink. They reported to the same superior, the steward, who managed the entire household's budget and supplies, but their day-to-day operations were strictly separate. This clear separation of wet and dry, of bottle and bread, reveals a household run with almost military precision. Every item, from a candle to a wedge of cheese, had its designated fortress and its dedicated guardian. The system was designed for accountability above all else. If the ale was sour, the butler answered. If the bread was moldy, the pantler was at fault. There were no blurred lines. This elegant, simple organization of space and duty was the hidden framework that allowed a castle or great manor to function not as a chaotic home, but as a disciplined, self-sustaining community. The same logic of control extended to the cloistered world of the monastery. Within the silent stone corridors of an abbey, the buttery was not a secular luxury, but a sacred necessity. Here, the officer in charge was known as the cellarer, one of the most important monastic officials. His duty was a profound fusion of the practical and the spiritual, for he managed the liquid sustenance that supported a community dedicated to prayer and labor. In a monastery, ale was not merely a safe alternative to water. It was a calculated part of the daily dietary allowance, a source of essential calories for men whose lives were defined by physical work in the fields and the rhythmic chanting of the divine office. The cellarer's task was one of holy stewardship. He had to ensure there was enough nourishing ale for the brothers, while also managing the more precious wine required for the celebration of Mass and for honoring important guests. Every drop was accounted for, not just against the budget, but against the rule of the order, which often dictated moderation and forbade excess. This turned the monastic buttery into a site of devout economy, where careful measurement was an act of piety. The meticulous records kept by monastic houses give us an astonishingly clear window into this world. Surviving account rolls, often written on long, sturdy parchment, detail the cellarer's operations with almost obsessive precision. They list purchases of barley malt by the quarter, payments to local brewers, and the exact yields from each brewing. They record the daily or weekly allocations of ale to the refectory, where the monks took their meals in silence, sometimes noting a special allowance during harvest time when the labor was most strenuous. These are not dry inventories, they are blueprints for a balanced life. They show a community where the earthly management of food and drink was not separate from spiritual pursuit, but its very foundation. A well-run buttery meant a healthy, stable community capable of sustaining its religious mission. The cellarer, therefore, wielded immense quiet influence. His ability to provision wisely directly impacted the monastery's self-sufficiency, its hospitality, and the physical well-being of every soul under its roof. In the monastery, the locked door of the buttery symbolized a vow as much as a security measure, a promise to use God's provisions wisely and without waste, ensuring that the material world reliably supported the contemplation of the eternal. The buttery's ledgers tell a story of shifting tastes across the centuries. In its earliest form, the room held the drinks of a local, insular world. For the Anglo-Saxon lord or the early Norman knight, the casks were filled with ale, brewed from barley malt right on the estate, or with golden mead, fermented from honey. These were homegrown staples, their production tied to the seasons and the harvest. But the contents of the room began to change as trade routes stitched Europe closer together. For a wealthy English nobleman in the 13th or 14th century, displaying a cask of fine Gascon wine from Bordeaux was a powerful statement. It spoke of international connections, of refined taste, and of significant wealth. For wine was heavily taxed and expensive to transport. The butler now had to master two different liquid economies: the steady bulk flow of domestic ale for the household and the careful, measured disbursement of precious imported wine for the lord's table. The room itself may have adapted, with a special locked rack or a reinforced corner for these valuable foreign barrels, setting them apart from the workaday ale. Then came another revolution, this time from the Low Countries. In the late medieval period, a new drink began to appear, hopped beer. Brewers in places like Holland and Flanders had discovered that adding hops, the flower of the hop vine, not only added a pleasant bitterness but acted as a powerful preservative. This hopped beer could last for months, even traveling long distances by ship without spoiling. This was a logistical miracle. A cask of hopped beer in the buttery was no longer a ticking clock, it was a stable asset. This likely influenced storage practices, allowing for larger inventories and reducing the frantic pace of brewing. The buttery could now stockpile drink for longer campaigns or unexpected guests. Finally, on the far horizon of the medieval world, the most potent change was brewing, literally. The art of distillation, once the secret of alchemists and apothecaries, began to filter into wider use. By the very end of the period, the butler might guard a small, stout bottle of distilled spirit, an aqua vitae or water of life. This was medicine, a luxury, and a concentrated form of wealth in a glass. Its fiery strength and high value would demand a new level of security, perhaps a locked chest within the locked room. Through each of these shifts, from ale to wine to beer to spirits, the buttery proved it was not a relic. Its purpose was constant, to securely manage the household's drink, but its methods and contents evolved. It was a room that quietly recorded the march of technology, the expansion of trade, and the ever-changing palette of history itself. Stepping through that heavy, locked door was a shock to the senses. The air was a living presence, cool and damp against your skin, thick with the scent of fermentation. It was the deep, earthy aroma of barley malt, the sharp, yeasty tang of active ale, and the rich, woody perfume of oak casks soaked through with decades of drink. Beneath it all lingered the clean, astringent note of vinegar from a nearby barrel, and the faint, waxy smell of tallow candles waiting on a shelf. This is not the dry, dusty scent of the pantry, nor the smoky, herbal chaos of the kitchen. This was the smell of controlled decay, of transformation held in perfect, liquid suspension. The room itself seemed to breathe slowly, a cave preserving its treasures. You would hear the sounds of that preservation, the quiet, rhythmic drip of a tap being tested into a pewter jug, the deep, resonant glug as ale poured into a vessel. Then there was the physical labor, the hollow, rolling thunder of a half-empty cask being shifted on its stand, and the solid thump of a full barrel being settled into its appointed spot on the stone floor. That floor, often slightly sloped toward a central drain, might feel cool and just a little slick underfoot, a permanent dampness from the endless washing and sluicing required to keep the space from becoming sticky and sour. Light was a scarce commodity here, a strategic tool. It might filter down from one high, small window, a narrow slit designed to let in cool air but block the sun's warming rays. Or in the windowless depths of a basement buttery, the only illumination would come from the very candles stored within, their flickering glow casting long, dancing shadows across the curved sides of the barrels. This was a space built for function, not comfort. Every sensory detail, from the chill in the air to the dimness of the light, was deliberately engineered for one purpose: to keep the ale stable, the wine sound, and the vinegar potent. It was a sanctuary of stillness, a deliberate contrast to the fiery, aromatic, and noisy workshop of the kitchen just a wall away. To stand in the buttery was to understand, with your entire body, that this was not a room for people. It was a machine built for liquids, and you were merely a temporary operator within its cool, dark, and quietly humming heart. That world of scents and sounds was also a world of strict, unspoken order. The buttery was a social ladder in miniature, a perfect reflection of the rigid hierarchy that governed every corner of medieval life. At the very top stood the butler himself, often a man of some standing, perhaps even a younger son of a gentry family. He was a gentleman in service, his authority absolute within those stone walls. His were the only keys that unlocked every door and every cask, a literal symbol of his total control over the household's liquid wealth. He moved through the room with purpose, checking his ledger, tasting a sample from a new barrel, issuing quiet commands. He was manager, accountant, and trusted guardian all in one. Directly beneath him, you might find an under-butler or a yeoman of the buttery. This was the butler's right hand, a senior servant entrusted with more responsibility. He might oversee the daily tapping of the casks for meal service, supervise the cleaning of the jugs and tankards, or manage the inventory when the butler was attending the lord in the great hall. He had a degree of access and knowledge, but never the full set of keys. Then came the muscle of the operation, the servers and the Garshans. These were the young men, often teenagers, who did the brute physical labor. Their world was one of weight and sweat. They rolled the heavy, sloshing casks into position from the delivery cart. They lifted full jugs onto the service hatch for the cupbearers to collect. They scrubbed the stone floor and sluiced the drain. They fetched and carried, their work defined by motion and obedience. Their access to the buttery was purely functional and always supervised. They entered to perform a specific task and then left, never lingering, never handling the keys or the ledger. This tiered access was the room's invisible architecture. The butler could go anywhere, touch anything. The under-butler could handle the stores, but not authorize their disbursement. The Garshans could only move what they were told to move. This microcosm of authority, from the gentleman with the keys to the boy heaving a barrel, shows us something profound. Medieval social structures were not abstract ideas. They were embedded into the very rhythm of daily work. Your place in society dictated not just what you ate or wore, but which door you could open, which object you were permitted to touch, and how close you could get to the sources of wealth and comfort. The buttery, in its cool, dim silence, enforced this order every hour of every day, making the hierarchy of an entire world feel as natural and unquestionable as the stone of its own walls. The buttery's silent barrels were born in fire and steam. To truly understand that cool, dark room, you must follow the journey backwards, to the heat and labor of the brew house. This was the starting point of the entire liquid economy, a place of bubbling cauldrons and the rich, sweet smell of malt. On a large estate, brewing was not a casual hobby, it was a major domestic industry, a regular cycle as vital as baking bread. And in a fascinating twist of medieval life, this critical production was most often overseen by women, known as brewsters. These were skilled professionals, sometimes the wives of tenants or specialized servants, who commanded the complex alchemy of turning grain into ale. Their work was physically demanding, involving hauling sacks of barley malt, managing enormous kettles of boiling wort over an open fire, and carefully nursing the fermentation in large troughs. When the brew was ready, judged by taste and experience, it was a perishable product, alive with yeast and ready to be consumed. It could not sit in the brew house. This is where the buttery's purpose snaps into sharp focus. The fresh, still active ale was transferred into wooden barrels and rolled or carried directly to the buttery's cool embrace. The room was not just a storage closet, it was the final link in a production chain, the stable endpoint where the volatile brew could settle, clarify, and be kept safe. The butler, waiting with his keys and his ledger, was the crucial connector between the maker and the consumer. He had to coordinate closely with the brewster, knowing exactly when a new batch would be ready for casking. His expertise determined how to manage the stock, perhaps blending the tail end of an older, milder cask with a newer, stronger brew to ensure consistency for the Lord's table. He decided the order of serving, knowing which barrels to tap first before they passed their prime. This seamless connection reveals the buttery as the beating heart of a closed-loop system. It was the regulated reservoir in a homegrown pipeline that began with grain from the estate's fields, was transformed by fire and skill in the brew house, and culminated in the measured servings at the great hall's tables. The butler did not just guard a treasure, he managed the flow of a living, breathing commodity from its birth to its final pour. His room was the calm, controlled center of a process that was anything but calm, the essential stillness after the storm of creation. The locked door itself was a public announcement of prosperity. In a humble cottage, a single barrel of home-brewed ale might sit in a shadowed corner, a simple necessity of life. But for a lord or a wealthy merchant, the very existence of a dedicated buttery, with its thick walls and iron lock, was a statement carved in stone. It declared, loudly and without words, that this household operated on a scale of such abundance that its drink required a fortress of its own and a specialized officer to command it. The room was not merely functional, it was a piece of theater in the architecture of power. Its size mattered, a cavernous space implied vast reserves. The quality of its contents whispered of connections and taste, fine Gascon wine for the Lord's table, spiced hippocras for honored guests. Even the number of servants bustling in and out of its hatch was a calculated display. A large buttery staff meant you could entertain lavishly and without delay, keeping the ale and wine flowing smoothly throughout a long feast. In the medieval world, hospitality was not just kindness, it was a currency of influence. To be a generous host cemented alliances, attracted skilled retainers, and demonstrated your place in the social order. A poorly provisioned household risked whispers of decline. Therefore, every cask rolled into the buttery, every exotic bottle placed on its shelf, was an investment in reputation. The butler, in his fine livery, was as much a part of this display as the knight in shining armor. He was the living proof that the Lord's wealth was so well managed, it required a gentleman to oversee its liquid form. So while the great hall showcased the spectacle of generosity, the buttery was the engine room that made that spectacle possible. Its locked door did not just keep things in, it kept up appearances, silently assuring all who understood its meaning that within these walls, the cup would never run dry. This meticulous paperwork turned the buttery into a nerve center of information. Beyond the cool stone and the scent of ale, there was the constant scratch of a quill. The butler was not just a keeper of keys, he was a bookkeeper. His daily duty included maintaining the buttery book, a detailed ledger that tracked the lifeblood of the household in numbers. Every transaction, every movement of liquid, was recorded with careful precision. When a cart arrived from a local brewer, The butler noted the exact number of barrels and their total volume in gallons. When a cask was tapped for the midday meal, he marked down how many quarts were drawn for the hall and how many for the kitchens. He recorded the special allowance of wine for a visiting knight and the smaller daily ration for the stable hands. Nothing was supposed to pass through his hatch without leaving a mark in his book. This created a continuous paper trail, a financial diary written in ink and ale. The system was designed for absolute transparency. It answered three critical questions at a glance: what did we have, what did we use, and what should we have left? If the physical count of ale in the casks ever fell short of the ledger's calculation, it was a red flag signaling waste, error, or theft. This made the buttery book a powerful tool for prevention. A servant knowing that every pint was accounted for was far less likely to risk stealing one, but this was not a private document. At regular intervals, often weekly or monthly, the butler would present his records to the steward, the household's chief financial officer. The steward would audit the buttery book, cross-referencing it with his own master accounts and the pantry's records. He might check the receipts from the brewer against the butler's entry of new stock. He would examine the daily issues to see if they matched the known number of people in the household. This audit was a formal, serious process. It was the household's internal revenue service, ensuring that the Lord's resources were managed honestly and efficiently. In this way, the buttery functioned as a surprisingly modern administrative hub. It blended the physical reality of storage with the abstract world of finance, tying every drop of drink to a line in a ledger. This wasn't just about guarding ale, it was about governing it, using data written on parchment to manage an economy that ran on barley and grapes. The butler, with his key in one hand and his quill in the other, stood at the very intersection of medieval might and medieval math. The butler's ledger, filled with numbers and tallies, was not the only place this room left its mark. We can hear faint echoes of its daily life in the stories and images that survived the centuries. Medieval literature and art offer us fleeting, precious glimpses of the buttery as it existed in the cultural imagination. In Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, the character of the Franklin is described as keeping his cellar so well stocked that his butler was never without ale or wine. That single word, butler, is a direct reference to the officer of the buttery, a detail so commonplace for Chaucer's audience it needed no explanation. It simply paints a picture of a prosperous, generous household where the drink flowed freely, a virtue attributed to a respected character. Beyond the written word, the buttery appears in the colorful margins of illuminated manuscripts. In these detailed illustrations, we might see a servant, bent at the waist, carefully drawing ale from a large barrel into a jug, while another figure stands by with a ledger. The setting is clearly a storeroom, cool and functional, its stone walls and wooden shelves implied by the artist's lines. These are not architectural blueprints, they are snapshots of routine labor. These references, while not perfectly precise historical documents, are incredibly valuable. They confirm the buttery's firm place in the everyday mental landscape of the time. In stories, the room often served as a backdrop for very human dramas. It was a workplace, as the manuscripts show, a hive of quiet industry. It was a source of refreshment and hospitality, as in Chaucer's description. But it could also be a site for mischief, a natural target in tales of cunning servants outwitting their masters. A popular medieval fabliau, a kind of humorous short story, might revolve around a clever page who finds a way to sneak extra ale from the buttery hatch, or a butler who turns a blind eye for a small bribe. These narratives tap into the universal tensions inherent in a system of strict control. They acknowledge the temptation that the locked door was built to defy. By analyzing these glimpses, we move beyond the cold facts of stone walls and iron keys. We begin to sense the lived experience, the sounds of gossip exchanged over a cask, the quick, nervous glance of a servant taking a clandestine sip, the butler's sigh of frustration at a spilled barrel. Literature and art allow us to perceive the buttery not just as an architectural feature, but as a social space charged with meaning, where duty, desire, and daily necessity constantly interacted. It was a room everyone in the household knew about, relied upon, and perhaps in their own way, quietly negotiated with every single day. archaeological digs give us the proof beneath our feet. While ledgers tell the story in ink, and literature hints at it in verse, it is the physical remains that let us walk through the door of a real buttery. An archaeologist sifting through the ruins of a medieval manor is not looking for a sign that says bottle room. Instead, they piece together the story from a specific set of silent clues. The first and most important is location. They search for a room directly accessible from the Great Hall, yet positioned before the kitchen complex. This transitional spot, a buffer zone between feasting and cooking, is the first major hint. Inside that space, they examine the floor. A surviving stone slab floor, especially one that is slightly sloped toward a central drain, is a powerful piece of evidence. It speaks directly to the messy, liquid nature of the work done there, designed for easy cleaning after the daily tapping of casks. Then there are the small, telling artifacts. The rusted remnants of an iron barrel hoop, a solitary ceramic jug stopper, or a piece of a lead wine pipe. These are the fingerprints of the buttery's purpose. Crucially, archaeologists look for an absence. They confirm the room shows no trace of a cooking hearth or fireplace. A buttery needed consistent, cool temperatures, so the presence of a hearth would immediately disqualify a space. Perhaps the most exciting find is architectural, the telltale outline of a service hatch, or squint, carved into a wall connecting the room to the Great Hall. This small, rectangular void in the stonework is a snapshot of the social order, the very portal through which drink passed from servant to cup-bearer. At sites like Willey Castle in Birmingham or the beautifully preserved Stokesay Castle in Shropshire, historians have used this exact checklist to identify probable butteries. These are not just labeled rooms on a tourist map. They are spaces where the logic we have been exploring becomes concrete. The stone drain proves the concern for spillage. The missing hearth confirms the need for a cool environment. The squint in the wall validates the system of controlled service. This physical evidence does more than confirm a room existed, it confirms a mindset. It shows us that every architectural and practical choice we have discussed was not theoretical, but was literally built into the foundations of daily life. The buttery was an idea made of stone and wood, and its ghostly outline in the ground is the final, undeniable word in its story. Stone drains and empty squints could not save the buttery from the turning of the world. Its decline was not a sudden collapse, but a slow fading, a room made obsolete by a cascade of changes in how people lived, drank, and built their homes. The first and most fundamental shift happened at the source. For centuries, brewing was a decentralized household art, but from the 16th century onward, the process began to centralize in the hands of commercial brewers in towns and cities. These professionals could produce ale and the new, longer-lasting hopped beer on an industrial scale. For a wealthy family, it became easier and often more economical to simply order barrels from a trusted brewer rather than maintain their own brew house with its dedicated staff and constant labor. The buttery's role as the endpoint of a domestic production line was severed. It was now just a storage room for purchased goods, and that changed its essential character. At the same time, the very vessels that held drink were evolving. The invention of strong, sealed glass bottles and the widespread use of stoneware jugs created new possibilities. Bottled beer and wine did not require the massive, stationary casks of old. They could be stored on shelves in a cellar, brought up a few at a time, and did not need a specialized room with a drain and a hatch for bulk service. The logic of the buttery, built around the monumental barrel, began to feel archaic. Why have a room designed for rolling and tapping casks when your drink arrived in crates and bottles? Perhaps the most dramatic change, however, was architectural and social. The medieval Great Hall, that vast communal theater where the entire household ate together, began to shrink in importance. Starting with the nobility and filtering down to the gentry, families desired more privacy. They retreated from the public hall to dine in smaller, more intimate rooms called parlors or withdrawing rooms. This social revolution made the old service system clumsy. A long trek from a buttery through a hall and into a private parlor was inefficient, architecture adapted. The integrated service suite buttery, pantry, and kitchen clustered together, was broken apart by a new invention, the corridor. This simple hallway allowed servants to move discreetly between specialized rooms and the new scattered dining spaces without crossing through the family's private living areas. The sideboard, or cupboard in the dining room itself, took over the buttery's final function. Now, bottles and decanters could be placed on a handsome piece of furniture right where the meal was served, ready to be poured by a footman. The buttery's squint, that carefully controlled portal, was now just a hole in a wall leading to an empty space, and what of the butler? His role did not vanish, it transformed. As the specialized bottle room faded, his title and duties expanded. He became less a master of casks and more a general superintendent of the household staff, a guardian of the silver, and the manager of formal dining. The keys at his belt now opened cabinets of fine china and storerooms of linens, not just barrels of ale. His expertise shifted from fermentation to etiquette, from ledger keeping to personnel management. The buttery, as a physical and purposeful space, was no longer his domain. It was repurposed, became a scullery or a storage closet, or is simply walled up and forgotten, its original function erased by the new rhythms of life. The room that had once governed the daily sustenance of a community was rendered a relic, a silent monument to a world where drink was a currency, service was a public spectacle, and every drop was a matter of account. The room may have vanished, but its name still whispers in our language. The most direct descendant is the word butler itself, a title that traveled a long road from the medieval Latin buticularius, meaning the keeper of the bottle. That officer of the cask, the guardian of the keys, saw his professional name outlive the very room that defined him. As his duties evolved into managing the entire household staff, his ancient title moved with him, a fossil of his original liquid authority. Even the room's name persists in surprising pockets. If you visit an Oxford or Cambridge college today, you might hear about the Buttery. This is not a stone-walled storehouse for ale, but a small shop or snack bar where students can buy provisions. It is a faint, domesticated echo, a linguistic ghost that remembers the room's core function as a place of supply. The connection is not literal, but it is profound. It tells us that the idea of the Buttery as a designated spot for essential goods was so ingrained that the name simply transferred when the goods changed from casks to crisps and coffee. More obscure, but wonderfully telling, is a piece of old slang. To have someone under your buttery meant to have them in your debt or under your influence. This phrase is a perfect snapshot of the social power the room represented. If the butler controlled access to a daily necessity, then anyone who relied on him for an extra measure or a better brew was quite literally under his thumb. They were subject to the economy of the hatch. These fragments of language are more than curiosities. They are the lasting echoes of a system where control over sustenance equaled power. Every time we use the word butler, we are unknowingly referencing a world where that man's most important tool was not a silver tray, but an iron key to a room of barrels. The buttery is gone, but in these words, its logic still holds a little sway, a reminder that the architecture of daily life always leaves its blueprint in the way we speak. These lingering words are clues, but they can also lead us astray. Over time, the buttery has gathered its share of myths, simple stories that smooth over its complex reality. Let's clear away the most common misconceptions. First and most persistent is the idea that it stored butter and dairy. This is a classic case of a word tricking us. Because it sounds like butter, we assume a connection. In truth, butter, milk, and cheese were the domain of a completely different space, often called the dairy or the larder, a cool room usually situated on a north-facing wall or even partially underground. The buttery was for drink, period. Another myth paints it as an underground cold cellar. While it was designed to be cool, it was not necessarily a basement. Many butteries were at ground level, their chill coming from thick stone walls, small windows, and strategic placement away from kitchens. They were temperature-controlled rooms, not dungeons. Then there's the belief that only the grandest castles had them. This is partly true. A dedicated, architecturally defined buttery was a mark of wealth found in manor houses, monasteries, and castles. But the function, the need to securely store and manage drink, existed everywhere. In a modest farmhouse, a locked cupboard or a designated corner with a single barrel served the same essential purpose. The scale was different, but the principle of guarded provision was universal. Finally, we must dismiss the notion that it was a dirty, unimportant storeroom. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was a secure, meticulously managed administrative center. The presence of a senior officer, the butler, and the daily ritual of ledger keeping elevated it far above mere closet. It was a prestigious nerve center, its orderliness a direct reflection of the household's overall discipline and prosperity. Debunking these myths is not just about correcting fact. It strips away the simplistic veneer and forces us to see the room in its true, sophisticated light, not as a quirky antique, but as a deliberate and intelligent solution to the fundamental challenges of its time. Dawn broke with the sound of a heavy iron key turning in a lock. The butler entered his domain, the cool, damp air greeting him as he surveyed his kingdom of casks in the pale morning light. His first duty was a physical inventory, a slow walk past the barrels, his hand resting on each one to gauge its weight, his ear listening to the hollow sound of the liquid within. This tactile check confirmed the numbers in his ledger from the night before. He might then draw the first allowance of the day, a weak, small beer for the servants breaking their fast, ensuring the household began its labor properly fueled. The room, silent except for the drip of a tap and the scratch of his quill, was a place of calm preparation before the storm of the day's service. As the sun climbed, the buttery transformed from a storehouse into a hub of controlled chaos. The approach of the midday meal sent a ripple through the lower servants' quarters. Cooks needed ale for their pottages, and the hall needed to be readied for the Lord's table. Now a quiet line would form at the squint, the service hatch in the wall. Inside, the butler or his under-butler stood ready. A servant from the kitchens would present an empty jug, stating its intended destination. The butler would fill it from a specific cask, note the exact amount in his book with a quick, practiced mark, and then place the heavy vessel on the sill of the hatch. From the other side, a cup-bearer of higher status would collect it, carrying it away to its assigned place. This ballet of request, measurement, and transfer repeated dozens of times, a seamless flow of liquid governed by ink and protocol. Nothing was poured without being recorded. Every pint for the scullions, every quart for the knights, every special cup of wine for a guest, each had its line in the buttery book. This was the system's moment of truth, where planning met practice, and the household's wealth was literally measured out by the cupful. After the clamor of the hall subsided, a reverse ritual might occur. In some households, a practice known as reversion took place. Unfinished jugs of ale from the Lord's table, considered too good to waste, could be returned to the buttery. The butler would assess what was left, perhaps blending it back into a cask of similar quality or setting it aside for the upper servants. Even waste was managed, its potential value reclaimed. As evening settled, the buttery returned to its state of quiet authority. By the light of a single tallow candle, the butler would tally the day's consumption, comparing the dip in his casks to the entries in his ledger. The numbers had to match. This daily accounting was not just bookkeeping, it was a diagnostic tool. A sudden spike in usage could indicate unexpected guests, while a slower rate might signal an upcoming shortage. These final calculations informed his next critical task, planning. He would consult his records to know when to call for the brewster to begin her next batch, or when to send an order to the vintner in town. The buttery's routine was a perfect self-repeating loop, a heartbeat of measurement, service, and security that kept the entire household alive and functioning. From the first key turn at dawn to the last ledger entry at dusk, this room did not simply hold drink, it orchestrated its life cycle. That meticulous system of control was not an English invention. The need for a secure bottle room echoed across the whole of medieval Europe, taking on different names but answering the same fundamental challenges. In the castles and manor houses of France, you would find the bouteillerie, a word that shares its Latin root with buttery, directly meaning the place for bottles. Here, the butler held a position of similar trust, managing the stocks of wine that were central to French aristocratic life, traveled the German-speaking lands, and the focus often shifted underground to the cellaré or the wine cellar. These were not just cellars, but professionally managed wine stores, cool and dark by nature of their construction, where the Kellermeister oversaw the careful aging and disbursement of regional vintages. In the sun-drenched stone of an Italian palazzo, the equivalent space was the cantina, a cool vault that served as the heart of the household's liquid wealth, often stocked with local wines and olive oils. The architectural expression adapted to the climate. In cooler, damper northern Europe, a ground floor room with thick walls was often sufficient. In the warmer Mediterranean south, a truly subterranean cellar was almost a necessity to keep wine from spoiling in the heat. But whether it was a stone-flagged room off the hall or a vaulted chamber beneath the courtyard, the core principle remained unshakable. Everywhere, a designated, secure space existed for the storage and management of drink, and everywhere, a single trusted officer held the keys. This common blueprint reveals something profound about the medieval mind. The challenges of food security, of managing perishable commodities, and of displaying hospitality as a form of power were universal. They transcended the local language and the specific vintage in the cask. A French count, a German knight, and an Italian merchant all faced the same logistical puzzle: how to reliably provision a large household in a world without refrigeration, and how to protect those valuable provisions from waste and theft. Their parallel solutions, from the bouteillerie to the cellerie, tell us that the buttery was not a quirky English footnote. It was a logical, almost inevitable response to the economic and social realities of an entire era. By seeing its cousins across the continent, we understand that this was not about a single room, but about a widespread, deeply ingrained system for governing the necessities of life. So the buttery was never just a room, it was an answer, carved in stone and secured with iron, to a question that defined medieval life: how you safely manage the one substance everyone needed every single day. Its existence solves the mystery of why medieval houses needed such a specialized space. The answer lies in the unique convergence of necessity and social order. Ale and wine were not mere luxuries. They were liquid calories, safe hydration, and the currency of hospitality. Storing them required a cool, dark fortress. Distributing them demanded a rigid system to prevent waste and theft, and displaying that abundance became a vital signal of power and prestige. The buttery sat at the exact intersection of all these demands. Its architecture provided the cool darkness. Its locked door and single officer enforced the control. Its service hatch choreographed the social hierarchy. And its meticulous ledger turned every pint into a line of accountable data. This room was a machine for managing a perishable, essential resource in a world without our modern conveniences. It tells us that the medieval household was not a chaotic place, but a carefully governed microeconomy where every drop of drink was counted, every servant's access was tiered, and every guest's cup was a calculated gesture. The mystery of the doorless room on the castle plan is solved when we see it not as an empty space, but as the heart of a living system. It was the command center for the butler, the end point for the brewster's labor, and the starting point for the household's daily rhythm. So the next time you walk through a historic great hall, pause by a plain, thick wall, look for the faint outline of a sealed-up hatch. That is where the buttery once connected. Behind that stone, a world of scent and sound and strict accounting hummed with purpose, ensuring the life of the entire home flowed smoothly, one carefully measured cup at a time. The humble buttery reminds us that history is not just about kings and battles, but about the ingenious, everyday solutions that allowed communities to thrive. It is a mystery solved, revealing the profound cleverness embedded in the ordinary architecture of the past.